Excellent.
Great. Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and today I'm here with Gregorio Billikopf, and we're going to be talking about his work on empathy. Would you like to introduce yourself, Gregorio?
Yes, I am Gregorio Billikopf. I'm here in Chile, and on the other side of the screen, I have this beautiful view of many volcanoes by Lake Yanquihue in the southern part of Chile, and it's lovely to be able to speak with you.
Oh, great. Yeah, I had come across your work quite a few years ago. You're a mediator and an author and a farm advisor specializing in labor management, and you've been at the UC Davis, University of California at Davis, and you'd created some manuals for direct party mediation model, kind of a framework that you developed, and it was really much based on empathic listening and on the work of Carl Rogers, and so you've done a lot of work around this empathic listening, and I learned a lot from reading your manual and as well as from your audios. You had an audio version of it, so it's a real pleasure to talk to you. And just wanted to talk about empathic listening and your insights about empathy. How did you even get interested in empathy to begin with?
Yes, I also want to say how exciting it is to me and what an honor it is to me to be speaking with you, as I have heard about you from some of my colleagues, and I am very excited about the work that you do. So to answer your question, one day I came to a full realization that my interpersonal skills were zero. And that I had so much to learn. And in fact, the first book that I picked up, I cried throughout the book because I saw that I was the bad guy. I was the bad guy in this interpersonal communications. And so little by little, I started reading more and studying more. And eventually, I came to Carl Rogers' client-centered therapy book, where I think if I would have read that book first, it wouldn't have clicked. But because I think I was better prepared by the time I got to it, it just all made sense. So what's interesting to me is that I would say that even most people who are trained in psychology don't understand empathic listening. And I was, in California, I was permitted to give seminars to psychologists where they could get continuing credit, continuing education credits for their work. But I would say this, is that people tend to confuse empathic listening with active listening. They were both. Carl Rogers was basically the father of both of those listening types of skills, and they're both based on empathy. So they have a lot in common. Empathic listening to me is particularly useful as a mediator, because I realized that I need to stop asking questions. As a mediator, it's not about me understanding who did what to whom. As a mediator, it's about the person speaking coming to understand themselves and what they're feeling. And that is what I finally got out of this through Carl Rogers. And so it's very interesting to me, because if we let somebody speak, we respect their pauses, we do all sort of things like that, so the other person speaks, then they begin to speak a little bit slower, they have more pauses, they speak more quietly, more tentatively, and eventually they start wondering about what's happening, about maybe they were part, maybe the conflict a little part at least was their responsibility. And so that is so wonderful. So in a way, I'm teaching now a class on mediation here in Chile.
Mm-hmm.
It's an international seminar, so anybody's welcome. It is in Spanish, but I have somebody from Mexico, and so we go from Mexico to Chile, but anybody else is invited to come. We're just beginning. And one of my students who works in human resource management said to me a couple of days ago, "But Gregorio, I didn't do anything." And I said, "That's the whole point. It's not about you. It's about if we listen, we truly listen to the other person who has a conflict, and we listen with empathy, and we listen without interrupting, and we don't interrupt the pauses." Normally pauses are there, so we're basically telling the other person, if I pause, it means your turn. But in empathic listening, pauses allow the person to reach even deeper and find out what it is that they have not yet discovered about themselves. And so oftentimes people will say, "You know, I've never said this to anybody before. You're the first person I've shared this with, and it's such and such and such." It's very powerful.
So you're seeing it. What I'm kind of hearing there is you're seeing a difference between active listening and empathic listening. Are you seeing active listening as more question driven and empathic listening more presence and listening driven? Or how are you seeing those differences?
Yes, precisely. And there is a place, there's definitely a place for empathic listening, and there definitely is a place for active listening, which sort of completed the circle of empathy for me. Okay, that same person who I was telling you about, who's a mediator in California, together with another colleague, they participated in one of my mediation seminars. We had a 4-day mediation seminar. And when I came back to work, I found in my desk a copy of a book that would also change my life for good. And that was Rosenberg's book. I'm trying to think of the name.
Nonviolent communication.
Thank you. Nonviolent communication. And so he uses the active listening. And what he does through active listening is he tentatively asks people for what they're feeling and what they're needing and so on. And so it's more than a question, it's a little bit of a trying out to see if I'm hearing you right. So I found out that when I tried to use empathic listening, when people were angry at me, that didn't work very well. So empathic listening is a wonderful tool for my listening to other people whose conflict is with another person. So when I'm a third person, empathic listening is the perfect tool. So I had this huge gap in my toolkit. I had a quarter of the situations, a quarter of a circle, a quarter of that pizza pie or whatever you want to call it, missing. Because every time I tried to listen with empathy for people who were upset at me for something, I didn't feel that I was really reaching them. And now with Rosenberg, that gave me that other quarter. So now I knew that I could respond to these individuals and say something like, you seem somewhat distressed, and you really need to be part of, you need to be heard. You need to, so I could actually say something like that. And that was precisely what the person needed to hear. And as Rosenberg mentions, it might take 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 going back and forth until you finally, the other person counts down to the point you can actually have a dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
where I can participate too, and we can both go back and forth.
Yeah. So with Carl Rogers, he would do empathic listening, just listen with his clients for like an hour, only doing reflection. He wouldn't give advice. He wouldn't ask questions. He would just keep reflecting what he's hearing. And so so the model from NVC or with nonviolent communications is you make these feelings guesses, like, oh, are you feeling so-and-so? And then the feeling, if they're feeling angry, you're looking for what's behind the anger. Are you feeling angry because you're needing to be heard, or are you needing safety, or what's the feeling behind these feelings? So it sounds like having that extra tool has helped you with connecting on a personal level, especially with people you're in conflict with. Better.
Right. And so I've learned, let's talk about NVC for just a little bit, because it's fascinating. Like, for instance, I've learned, and people tell me, Gregorio, what you do is not really NVC, it's your own little brand of it. And that's fine. We all learn from somebody else when we apply it in our own lives. So, for instance, I've learned not to ever tell somebody, you seem angry, because that will send people to defensiveness quicker. They become more defensive. So I'll reduce that, and I'll change it to you seem somewhat distressed, or something which doesn't seem as accusatory as telling somebody that they're angry, for instance.
Well, there's a difference between saying you are angry and a question, are you feeling angry?
There is
that's like the needs guess, right? You're like, I don't know, are you angry? I don't know if you're angry. Are you angry? And then they can kind of correct it versus saying you are angry. So there's kind of a subtle difference there, or significant.
Okay, so correct. What I see as Rosenberg saying is, even though I was very direct in saying you are angry, but the way I saw his tentativeness, it wasn't a question for him. He was actually saying to the person, you seem, or you might be, feeling this emotion, okay? And so the way I interpreted Rosenberg was not as him doing either of those, not coming right out and saying you're angry, but neither was he asking, are you angry? I interpreted him as sending out a guess, sending out this tentative guess in the form of a statement that was a question, but not a question.
Mm-hmm.
And so going back to the word anger, whether we ask the person, are you feeling anger, or you are angry, or you seem angry, or you might be angry. Either way, the word angry, I've discovered, is not a good word to use.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, I prefer, regardless of whether we're going to ask it or tentatively say it or tentatively ask it, I would prefer to use the word, stress, or out, or for the word anger. In other words, I would substitute that word.
So instead of like anger has like a real intensity, so you're using a word that's not as intense, and then kind of asking that, because if you say it's really intense, they might get upset about that. But if you say something not quite so intense, like, are you feeling stressed, or then it's not as,
because my point here is I want them to save face.
Mm-hmm.
A part of this empathic thing is allowing people to save face. Now, because Rosenberg gives credit also to Carl Rogers. So here we have Carl Rogers, we have Rosenberg, we have the work that I do, and we give credit to the people who influenced us, even though what we do might not look as much. Like, for instance, okay, now let's go back to empathic listening. I don't reflect in empathic listening. In empathic listening, I try not using reflection, so that. In fact, a fellow mediator one time said, Gregorio, I don't believe that you can actually be quiet and let somebody talk for more than maybe 10, 15 minutes and that they would keep talking. And I said, you know what? They'll talk for 2 hours. And after 2 hours, I've got to stop them because that's as much as I can do. I can't do any more than the 2 hours. So that's sort of my limit. But if I had a further limit, we could go further, okay? And so they couldn't believe me, and that somebody could talk for more than 15 minutes. So we went into a mediation situation. The person spoke for over an hour, and I stopped them. And I looked at my fellow mediator and I said, do you suppose that this person could talk for a little bit longer? Do they have more to say? Do they have more pain that could come out? And finally, this colleague admitted that indeed I didn't have to say anything. So I have taken Carl Rogers' empathic listening to the following extreme, to the extreme that all the person has to do is know that I'm truly there, present, listening, and caring. If I show the person through my body language, my facial expressions, my honoring their pauses without interrupting them, then they know that Gregorio Billikopf is there and he really cares and he's interested. So I don't use reflection in verbal reflection. I go even further. There are some tools that I learned from Carl Rogers that are really excellent, such as, just minimal comments like, just a little voice or a little something that comes out, these minimal responses, minimal positive reassurances. As we talk, you're doing that to me. You're gently moving your head a little bit, and I know you're present. I can feel you're present. I can feel you're very interested. And see, that's the key. The moment we feel the other person is no longer interested, that's when we stop talking. I want to give you an example that I really enjoy. I sometimes give a 2-person seminar on empathic listening. So how does that work? One person will bring a problem to share with person number 2. And when person number 2 has finished listening to person number 1, I'll switch them, and the other person has a turn listening. And what I do is I tape this, I record these listening sessions, and I use them in my empathic listening courses and seminars and online classes and so on. I use them in different places. And in some instances, when they're very, very private issues, I'll transcribe them for my books, and I won't actually put the real people, but I'll disguise them a little bit so that nobody knows what they are. So in one of the situations, one of the persons I was training, and I would stop them when they started doing things that were not appropriate in terms of being truly empathic. I would stop them for a moment and say, don't ask them a question. Instead, you might ask them, if you really feel like you have to interrupt, maybe ask, what are you feeling at this moment? Or tell me more. If you feel that you really have to say something, well, the idea is for you not to say anything at all. Okay, so we did this for a while. And this person was doing very well, but you could see after about 45 minutes that a little click went off, and the person who was listening couldn't listen anymore. She started getting really fidgety. She looked at the clock. She was finished. She was done. And so the individual who was being taped went on and spoke for another 45 minutes beyond that. So when the person who was listening left the room, asked her, I said, tell me a little bit about this experience. And she said, no, Gregorio, really enjoyed the first 45 minutes. I felt really listened to. And after 45 minutes, I could tell that the person who was there to listen to me was done with me.
Mm-hmm.
She knew it. And then what she said was really interesting to me. She said, I looked at you behind the video camera and you seemed so interested that I kept talking.
Mm-hmm. So she was speaking to you at that, and she could sense that this person wasn't really listening anymore and had detached. But then she was speaking to you.
Yes.
And
Edwin, we all have friends who don't have that sense of, like when we're done with somebody, for whatever reason, maybe we're hungry, maybe we have another meeting. There are really good reasons why we might not be able to listen any longer. Okay. But don't you have some friends who are missing that little click? And even though you're not that interested, at some point they might continue to talk.
Well, I have my mother who just talks and talks and talks, and she doesn't care if I'm listening or whatever. It's just, and everybody in the family complains about it. So,
so some people are missing. Some people are missing that little chip. That's gone. So they will talk. It doesn't matter who they'll talk to their dog. They'll talk aloud. They'll talk. Even though you might be doing something completely different, they'll talk. But I think most people can really tell if you're listening or not. And on one occasion, one of my students here in Chile, we were at the University of Chile in Santiago, and he was giving a seminar, and I just casually looked at my watch to see how much time had gone by. He interpreted that as Gregorio is finished.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to be quiet. I've got to stop. I've spoken too long. That was not my intention, but there are people who are very, very, very sensitive.
Well, what I'm hearing from you is that you've learned from like Carl Rogers and Marshall Rosenberg, and you've developed more your own sense of how to approach the listening, and you don't do so much reflection of what people are saying, but have more of a listening attitude, a sense of attention, and that's sort of the approach that you've been using. What something that I really like is, I've used is what I call an empathy circle. So this is small groups of about 4 people in a circle, and they do mutual empathic listening where one person, we have maybe a theme, or you can even just talk about what's going on for you in the moment, and that you select someone in the group to speak to, and you speak to them and they reflect back what they're hearing you say, so using more of the reflection, and that then you speak until you feel heard. It stays you 5-10 minutes, so you can put a time limit on it. Then the listener, once the listener is done, the speaker is done, feels heard, they say, I feel fully heard, and then it's the listener's turn to select someone and speak to them, and then they reflect back, and it goes around for maybe a couple hours. And this is just a way of practicing that empathic listening. And you'll have like lawyers who kind of hate it because they're so wanting to control the conversation with questions, for example. Or there's people who will say things like, my ideas are so important, I have to get them out or I'll forget them. And they want to, kind of interrupt, but they can't. So, and this is kind of a practice of just practicing to speak, listen, be heard. And also you have several people in the group. So you're kind of seeing different styles and different approaches and different energies. So that's like one approach that I've been working on and kind of developing.
Edwin, that is fantastic. And what I would say is this: is that each one of these variations, okay, so we can have the active listening where people ask questions, which of course are very dangerous because sometimes those questions are very leading, and people don't know how to ask them. But let's say let's say active listening at its very best. Okay, active listening is very best with some questions that really help the individual dig a little bit deeper. We also have what you're talking about, this reflective. We reflect back what we believe we're hearing from a person. Then there's all these different varieties of empathic styled listening skills. And what I'm coming to the conclusion is that every one of them is important.
Mm-hmm.
Every one of those variations is important, and it fits perfectly under different settings. In terms of empathic listening, where I take Carl Rogers' ideas to the very extreme, what I like about that, and it's not easy, by the way, because sometimes people repeat themselves and repeat themselves and repeat themselves, but see them change from, I look at conversations, and I developed like a light, from green light to orange to red. Green means the person is talking, they're listening. Then orange, we're asking questions, and so I say, be careful. Be careful. You're starting to ask questions, because if you're not careful, before you know it, you get to the red. You're now giving solutions that may be really more solutions that are good for yourself than solutions that are good for somebody else. So what Carl Rogers taught me is that the solutions for people are often, or most often, when they have a problem of an interpersonal nature and so on, solutions are often within their own reach. They're inside themselves. So as a mediator, what I have found out is that if I use the extreme Carl Rogers empathic listening with no reflection, just a truly present myself, okay, it is wonderful. Because the person often surprises themselves. They will change subject, and they'll say things like, this makes me think of such and such that happened to me. And maybe this thing is related to the conflict in some way. When I was young, this happened to me, or I went through this experience. And they change the topic from this particular conflict sometimes, and they'll talk about a previous conflict, or they'll talk about other things in their life that if I was asking questions, then I am actually guiding the conversation.
It's like they're taking off layers of an onion, getting down to a deeper, metaphorically, getting to a deeper core issue. The outer layer might seem like what the issue is, but if you take off those layers, it's getting to a deeper core. And maybe the question is how do we, or that the empathic listening is a way of kind of feeling into that deeper core of the issue, whatever, and then addressing that core issue. I have a story about that with my own family. They're very conservative evangelical Christians, and I've talked a lot about empathy with them, and they always thought, oh, this is kind of strange. They didn't really understand, because when growing up, we had a lot of kind of conflict like in the family, but then I started learning more about empathy, and I just started empathizing more. But then a conflict came up between my sister-in-law and my mother at Christmas, and it was about the children had gotten into some gifts. The question was, who is responsible for the, putting those gifts there? And then, sister-in-law kind of criticized my mother, and my mother says, don't talk to me this way, and kind of things were just escalating. So I just started doing empathic listening with both of them, listening to one, reflecting until they felt heard, then to the next, for maybe 10, 15 minutes till they calmed down. Then I asked them to do empathic listening with each other, and it helped, facilitate the back and forth. And then it's like the different layers came down exactly like you're talking about. And then an issue came up. It was that my sister-in-law felt like she wasn't accepted in the family, that she didn't have a sense of belonging, because she said, oh, I'm coming from this poor Russian family, you're more well-to-do, I don't feel accepted. And then my father got up and said, oh, money's not important. I was a refugee, I came here as a refugee, had nothing. You've really contributed to the family. You give me these, I have these wonderful grandchildren now. And then they both got up and hugged in the middle of the room, right? And then it kept going, and the whole thing turned into a whole family empathy circle of the whole family kind of dialogue. And they'd all been hiding in the corners during this conflict, and they all kind of came in and kind of joined this listening. And that was the core issue, was not where the gifts were kept, but the core issue that we tapped into was a sense of belonging and acceptance. And when that was kind of addressed, then it was like people just came together with this really beautiful connection. So as an illustration of those layers.
Edwin, stories like that make me want to cry. I don't cry normally for sad things,
Mm-hmm.
but a story like the one you just told me makes me want to cry with joy. Because that is so beautiful. It is so beautiful when people can finally connect. Now, in party-directed mediation, the mediation model that I developed about 20 or so years ago, what I discovered was that if I could listen to one person alone, without the other person being present, then that had certain advantages. But it really went against the grain. So most mediators at that time told me, oh, no, you can never do things in private. You cannot have pre-caucusing with anybody, because then it's suspect that you, as the mediator, are going to take sides. So here's what I discovered that I'm so excited about, that mediation oftentimes becomes a little bit of arbitration, where the mediator begins to suggest that maybe one of the parties may be right about this and the other party may be right about that. So the mediator becomes a little bit of an arbitrator. It's very, very easy to fall into that trap, okay? Because each one of us has situations in life that makes us take one side over the other naturally or normally. So in the methodology that I developed, I said, you know what? You probably are going to take one side or the other, but it doesn't matter as long as you don't do certain things, okay? There's certain things you should not do, but if you in your mind for a moment, you start agreeing with someone, that's not going to be the end of the world. So let me explain myself. So by meeting alone with one of the parties, okay? So in this case, for instance, it could be your Russian sister-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
She can say whatever she wants to say in any way she wants to say it. And if there's anger, and the things that she says may come out a little bit hurtful even, that's okay. Now, I'm not saying that anger is okay. I'm just saying that her expressing the anger is a good thing, okay? And so she'll talk and she'll tell me things, and eventually, when she feels totally heard, I have a key question to ask her. And the key question is this: how do you feel about your mother-in-law? And if her answer is, I really love her, then that tells me that there's something very positive that has been recovered there at a moment. Because when we're in a conflict, we, no matter who it is, somebody we very much love, we put that person in our enemy camp for a moment. They cease to be a person, they become our enemy for a moment. Okay, so through this pre-caucuses, I'll listen. Then I'll say, can you tell me something positive about the other person? And sometimes they try, okay, or they say, what, this is about the Christmas problem we're having. What does this have to do with something positive about the other person? What that tells me is that I haven't listened long enough. That the problem is so deep that it's, we need to meet again in another pre-caucus and keep listening.
So you're sort of saying that people will not say something positive about someone else until they've really been heard deeply enough. So that's sort of a little bit like your test, is you can keep listening until they can say something positive about the other. And then you know that you've sort of reached an adequate level of empathic listening or hearing the person.
One of my students worked on a conflict between a father and a son. And that conflict was so deep that it took over 6 months before people were willing to say something really positive about the other without leakage. Now, leakage would be, saying positive but making a face that denies what they just said, or saying something positive and quickly saying but. It's not really the positiveness. So in your case, we had a wonderful situation where there was so much love there already that you were able to fix something at the moment, and it's lovely and it's wonderful. And I've had situations like that, and I'm so grateful for those situations where there's so much love there already, and people don't consider themselves permanent enemies. Okay, when you get to a situation that's very, very serious, the nice thing about party-directed mediation is that we're not in a rush. We're going to listen, and then we're going to permit positive feelings to ferment over time. So sometimes the word ferment is used as a negative word. I use it as a positive word, positive fermentation. So I'm going to say that positive feelings are going to ferment with a person over time. So in another situation, this student of mine was so patient, and over time listened, and one of the individuals finally was ready to apologize to his supervisor for treating her poorly because his supervisor was a woman. He had never worked for a woman before. And the moment that happened over time, that he became softer, he realized that he had done something that really wasn't appropriate. He wasn't ready the first meeting, nor the second, nor the third. And so in party-directed mediation, we do several things. One, we listen in a non-judgmental, full of love, full of empathy, until you're ready. We are not going to coerce you. We're not going to force you. We love you. We trust you. Eventually, you're going to change a little bit how you feel. And as you do, then we're going to explore those feelings. So that's the empathic listening part. Then there's that test question. Can you tell me something positive about that person? That helps us better gauge where we are. And then there's another part of the pre-caucusing, and that is teaching people how to negotiate. In other words, how to ask questions, how to say things in ways that don't offend. being able to both learn how to listen and to, let's take a particular example. Let's say this person found a letter in her desk that was left there by a supervisor, and that letter made her very upset. So we would actually help the person learn how are ways that she could bring up the letter and do so with empathy and kindness, and ways that allow the other person to save face, rather than you left this letter, okay, you did this. So it's less pointing, and we allow people to save face. So party-directed mediation then is a combination of a lot of empathic listening, where people take us wherever they want to go until they're actually ready, until they begin to say things like, maybe some of this is my fault. Invariably, if we listen long enough with enough empathy, people will begin to say things like, you know, Gregorio, I think I know why they're mad at me too, because I said this at one point. See, these are beautiful, because they can bring this, they can bring all of these issues back to the table. And just like you said, in the situation that I became so emotional listening to you, because what you did was so beautiful, that these people got to the point that each other, and that there was love there.
Well, it sounds like you're really looking at kind of being open in terms of different methodologies and tools to see what will work. And it's really about what can you do to bring people together. And so in terms of time, I would love to, we've gone for almost an hour. We might want to close this. I'd love to chat, again, to continue to kind of this exploration of how to do this mediation, and how do we use empathy to bring people together, because it's such a broad and rich topic. I would love. I keep having ideas kind of popping up that I'm wanting to share as well, but just in terms of staying within our about an hour time frame. Is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion, Gregorio?
No, I was very moved by our conversation. I rejoice in the success you had. I'm very emotional right now thinking about the success you had. And that's how we bring peace into this world, one person at a time, one conflict at a time.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for doing this conversation with me. And with that, I will stop the recording.